Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And this week we're talking about beliefs and worldviews.
Yeah.
And especially as it relates to personality type.
And how to find, I guess, like, how can you change your worldview? What do worldviews do for us? And are we in control of them at all or not?
Yeah, what I find interesting about this entire topic is that I think of everything that we talk about when it comes to personal development and also just in general, like your relationship with reality and how to have the healthiest relationship with reality. I think the one thing that feels the most sacrosanct to people, the one thing that they never really, that they don't volunteer to reevaluate is their belief system or their worldview. Like that's the one thing we don't touch. Which I find so interesting because your belief systems and your paradigms and your worldviews create the infrastructure of your entire relationship to reality. Like basically your worldview and your belief is it's the filter through which you experience reality.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that I think most people that's the thing that people tend to be the most protective of and don't really, like they feel like they chose that one a while back. Sometimes it was chosen for them. And they think that this is the one thing that is the area that you don't get to touch.
Or they trick themselves. I mean, when I was like super religious and spiritual, it was kind of this thing like, oh, I can explore alternate ways of seeing the world as long as I come back to this original answer that I've already got in my head. Like, oh, I want to maybe look at maybe a different religion or different expression of how people do things. You can explore that all you want. Like, look at that. As long as you're safe and you still come back to believing how you believe right now. And that's kind of how I would trick myself into believing I was more open-minded or having more of a live mind at the time than I actually did.
Yeah, like you are allowed to ask any question as long as this stays the same answer.
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about beliefs and worldviews, and we generally reference back to this idea of not outsourcing it. Like if you have adopted a belief or worldview in your life, that's especially something that you should reevaluate and make sure that it is authentically yours, that it's in alignment with who you are as a person. But we want to talk a little bit about worldviews and beliefs as it relates to our personality type and how do we ensure that we're crafting the healthiest one for us. Now, we did a podcast a while back on personality types and religion. And what basically came out of that, I would say that sort of the fundamental principle that arose out of that conversation is that as long as your dominant cognitive function for whatever personality type you are, and this is what we call the driver in the car model, as long as your dominant cognitive function is being rewarded or fed or not oppressed or suppressed by your religion, you're probably going to stay there for a while. But if it is, if your dominant process can't come out to play, if it can't be nourished, if you feel like it's being oppressed, it's only a matter of time before you leave it for something else.
If you're a brand new listener, by the way, when she says dominant cognitive function or driver, and you need a reference point for that, if you just started listening, go to personalityhacker.com, type into the search bar car model, and you're going to get a bunch of resources that will explain and give you context and anchor point to understand what Antonia is talking about right now.
Right. So the perspective we took in that podcast was that we aren't actually trying to pick on any belief system. And then we want to maintain that position. Like, it's not really about what the belief system is or what the worldview is. Like, that's yours. You get to have that. It's not a matter of trying to poke holes into anything that you believe. We're trying to take more of a meta perspective and give ourselves permission, collective permission to even reevaluate our mindset, or it's not our mindset, but our belief system and our worldview. And the reason why we want to do that is you and I both have had this experience where we didn't feel permission to question our belief system or our worldview. And because of that, we both got ourselves into really bad situations. For you allowed yourself to enter an abusive relationship that lasted for a while and was like, it was pretty devastating.
Yeah.
And for me, I didn't feel permission to question my belief system, and it led me down a path of a lack of integrity. And then I ended up behaving in a way that I felt awful about. I made decisions that were incredibly destructive for myself and others. And it got me into a place where I had no character left. And for both of us, we've both been into, at least to some extent, into this concept of development and growth most of our lives. Like, we're just kind of wired that way. You and I, both of us are. But the one thing we were not allowed to touch was our belief system. It was like the one thing that we had no permission around, or we could question as long as we came to the right answer, the quote unquote right answer. And so for us, again, it's not what the belief system is, it's whether or not we have permission to take an aerial view or a meta perspective and observe it from a dispassionate space where we're not holding on to it so tightly. We're able to get a little bit of like a 1 degree of separation, look at the belief systems and the worldviews from the outside in and ask ourselves why this belief system is the emergent of all of the systems running in our lives.
Yeah, I would say for me, and I think both of us actually, to piggyback off of that, we were interested in personal growth our entire lives since we were very young. Like personal growth, or at least trying to become better versions of ourselves, has been something we're interested in for a while. But I think I hit a glass ceiling in how far I could take that when I was limited by the worldview itself. So I would grow and develop, but I had to always loop it back to my religious paradigm, my religious worldview. And there were things that were just beyond that now, since I've allowed myself to exit out of a worldview, I wouldn't say I've let go of my entire worldview. There's parts of it that I've integrated and taken with me. I've just expanded my worldview. It's not like I swapped it. It's not like I said, that's worldview A, and now I'm going to go to worldview B. It's more like that's worldview A, now I'm going to add in worldview B. And worldview B gives me more territory. And then I add in worldview C. So I keep leveling up and adding to that. And that was, for me, this happened within the last 10 years. That's when my personal development hit an acceleration point. I got to a place where now, because I'm willing to take in more territory as my worldview, I think this happened for you too, not only am I not stuck in bad situations because of my limitations there, not only are you stuck potentially in, inauthentic or out of integrity situations, we're able to get back in alignment with those things. And then we're also to expand and grow at an accelerated rate. And that is a key for me as personally. Like that is just, it turned it like the gas pedal. It went from like driving into like a rocket fuel engine.
Yeah. I think when it comes to worldview, we instinctively know that if we reevaluate our belief system and we look at it critically, it may not hold water, or at least that's an instinctive fear we have. And because it provides the scaffolding for everything else, it means that if we end up having a relationship with our belief system, that means transcending it. That means letting it go and moving on. How do we explain that to everybody and everything else in our lives?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of incentivizations, there's a lot of incentives, rather, to not go down this road. And yet, when you give yourself permission to do so, at the end of the road is a place of sovereignty. And that includes reevaluating. We talk about you can ask whatever question you want as long as you come to the right answer. What it really should be is ask every question you want to ask, and then the right answer is whatever is authentic to you. And that could be staying in your worldview.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be leaving it. It doesn't have to be, it's not like if you ask all the questions and you end up back where you started, that doesn't mean you did something wrong necessarily. It doesn't mean that. It's whether or not you have permission to not loop back. It's whether or not you feel full sovereignty to, truly be critical. And if looping back isn't authentic for you, you've given yourself permission to move on.
When we're talking about worldviews, one of the challenges here is it's kind of like a fish in water. A fish doesn't really know waters around it. It's its entire experience. So we're talking about something, it's like questioning almost to some degree the nature of reality in a sense, or your reality at least as a person, saying, okay, I'm in this reality. What about this do I like, not like, what's true, what's not true? And that can be difficult. It can be challenging and difficult because you're so much in it to question it. It's like, how do you get enough perspective to see what you can't see because you're in the midst of it so much? So that's where we're coming at this from, this idea that you're stuck in this place. So you have some awareness probably. You're listening to this podcast and you read personal development or personal growth things, or at least things around personality typology. You have a notion that there are other perspectives of seeing things. There's an expansion of your worldview or a different worldview you can take. But again, that idea of being a fish in water, how do I see what I can't see? You can only get glimpses of it. So this brings us into the conversation around what we talked about last week on the podcast when we were talking about emotions. I mentioned this idea of access points of emotions. If you want to feel a certain emotion, you can use your physicality to access emotion. And we were talking about last week also about, if you want to access the unconscious mind, you can study things like lucid dreaming or learn meditation. And you can use your breath, how you breathe, because it's usually an unconscious process. Our minds just breathe for us. You can take conscious control of an unconscious process like breath and then get access to your unconscious mind. So the question comes, for us as people, and it probably depends on personality type as well, where are the access points for us? If we are a fish in water, if our worldview is so much a part of our experience that we want to try to get a distant third-person view of that, where is the equivalent learning how to control your breath or changing your physicality and projecting a different emotion into yourself? How do you do that with your worldview? Where is the access point? And this is where we believe personality typology can come in play and be very helpful. And one of the places that I've always thought in the past of an access point is how we see the world. Our perceiving process seems like the obvious place for an access point for how we show up and view our reality or view our worldview. So obviously we all have the way we see the world, our perceiving process and our personality type. And you can go look up your individual personality type on our website to know what yours is. But we all have a unique way of seeing the world based on how our mind is wired. And that seemingly is the access point for worldview. However, I would posit that that is probably not the best access point. The reason is because our perceiving process doesn't really make much judgment. It's just focused on what channel we're tuned to, in a sense. We are tuned to this channel, and that's what we're perceiving in. So we kind of see what we tune to see, in a sense. Are there other access points in our personality? And we would posit that your judging process or your decision-making function in your cognitive functions of your personality are potentially a much better access point for worldview examination because they give you that evaluative process to look at the worldview and say, does this, whatever, fill in the blank for your cognitive function, does this work for me? Does this create harmony in life? Does this make sense? Does this resonate with me? Depending on your personality, those are the questions you'll be asking around the worldview you're living in.
Right. And not to say that your perceiving process doesn't come into it. Of course, your perceiving process also helps craft your worldview and your belief. This is, as Joel just mentioned, this is an access point. This is a side door to getting into and figuring out whether or not your belief system, or being able to just kind of see your belief system from, one degree of separation. We noticed this played out with us because we were asking if there was an access point that both of us used in order to be able to look at our belief systems from one degree of separation. And we realized that there was a trend, even though the answer was different for each of us. For me, it was learning a specific model. Once I learned the Graves model, or what's called spiral dynamics, as soon as I started learning models like that, my belief system started to not make sense anymore. And so my introverted thinking process, my decision-making or judging process of introverted thinking, it wasn't satisfied in my belief system, but I wasn't able to really understand that until I went, okay, so my criteria, my evaluative criteria in the world is things making sense. Does my belief system make sense? And as I picked up more models for understanding how things work or trends and patterns, etc., I was like, nope, I don't think it makes sense for me anymore. And for you as an ENFP, your judging process is introverted feeling or authenticity. And for you, it was basically not, it was not hitting your authenticity anymore.
Actually, I would say that the first step was it wasn't working for me. From a real sense, it was probably my tertiary or 10-year-old process of effectiveness. I always said, you do these things in life, you follow this worldview, things will work out in this way. And my life didn't work out the way that was projected to me. So I said, wait a minute, this isn't working the way it's supposed to. And that led me to go and evaluate, is this authentic for me? So it was actually one level removed for me first. I actually went through the process of this isn't playing out the way it was supposed to. And then I got into the authenticity piece and said, maybe I need to think about this differently. Maybe I need to have something that feels more resonant with me. Maybe that would work better.
And that's a really good point, because when we talk about our judging process or decision-making process, we're actually talking about the polarity of the decision-making process, as well as its photonegative, its revert, or its opposite, its polarity opposite. So for introverted feeling, the polarity opposite of introverted feeling is extroverted thinking, which is what you just mentioned as your tertiary process. Or is this working out? Is this playing out the way that I thought it was going to play out? And when it wasn't, then that triggered you to get into your secondary auxiliary process or co-pilot process of introverted feeling. And then you're like, and also, I don't think this is right for me. I think it probably was very similar for me too. It was a matter of extroverted feeling. Does this feel like it's getting needs met? And when I looked around my belief system or my paradigm, I found a lot of people who were actually quite unhappy. And so that...
Including you.
Including myself. Including myself, my ex-husband. Like, I was like, I don't think this is playing out, right? Like, but in a way of, was it meeting people's needs? Was it creating happiness? And the answer was no, it isn't. And I'm not finding a place for myself in this paradigm anymore. And that's when it triggered me to get into is this making sense for me anymore? I think that's an excellent point. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about using your judging process for whatever personality type you are, and really the polarity judging process, not just whatever is your, dominant or auxiliary judging process, but actually what the polarity is. And then using that to ask yourself some honest questions about your belief system. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, what that polarity looks like. And then when you discover what your polarity is, I mean, you might already know what your cognitive function stack, what's technically called your cognitive function stack, or what we call the CAR model. You might already know what that is for your type, but we're going to ask some questions or give you some questions to be able to reevaluate your belief system through the lens of the polarity that you're using. And I think the reason why the judging process polarity is a better side door than just the perceiving process is because your judging process is how you evaluate everything, or at least that polarity is. It's how you determine how important something is. It's how you figure out whether or not your life is playing out the way that you want it to play out. And so since that's your filter for determining whether or not things are the way they should be, because it's our judging processes that make should statements. Our perceiving processes don't. They're just the way that we take in information. It's just how we engage with reality around us. It's going to inform how we learn. It's going to inform certain things about how we pick up information, but fundamentally it's pretty passive. It might not be passive in the sense that it encourages you and motivates you to want to go learn more, but fundamentally it doesn't make any decisions all on its own.
It will also take the lead from your judging process. Typically, there's been parts of my life where I've turned off things I've seen in life because my judging process at the time said, don't look at this.
Right.
So it takes the lead from your judging process. Your perceiving process does.
Yeah, exactly. And fundamentally, though, when we decide to do anything, we're doing it from that polarity. That's our decision-making, that's our judging process. When we make a decision, it is fueled by the information that comes from our perceiving process. Information is taken in through that. But fundamentally, our choices, our decisions are from that polarity. So this makes a better side door because it comes with a bunch of should criteria. It's a bunch of should statements. It's a bunch of should evaluations. So we're going to give you some of their shoulds, or at least help you calibrate your shoulds in a better way. So for me, my polarity is my stronger judging process is introverted thinking, and my less strong judging process is extroverted feeling. It's also what we call harmony. And for me, the polarity is around what makes sense and what gets everybody's needs met. And a lot of times this comes down to belief, right? With extroverted feeling, we're creating all sorts of social contracts, unspoken social contracts, in order to ensure that everybody's needs are met. And so we'll create social beliefs around that. Like the rules we make, the social rules that we make, that we assume everybody are aware of, that's all a collective, we're choosing to believe this together. We're choosing to think these thoughts together because we want it to play out in a certain way. And introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy, introverted thinking couldn't give two craps about what other people think or what other people have to say on that. Introverted thinking wants clean data that is subjective. It makes subjective sense to the individual, but it still plays around in this realm of belief, what we should be thinking. Should we be thinking something that is more quote unquote data pure, or should we be thinking something that we've all collectively chosen to think together? But it very much stays in that sense of information exchange, data, etc. That's why people who lead with extroverted feeling still have quite a bit of interest in information and data, right? Because extroverted feeling is still taking in information and data in order to help determine what we are going to collectively be believing.
It's usually social data. Like extroverted feeling is probably more likely to, and I don't want to project this on you if this isn't you, but like tabloid magazines or like what's happening in the culture, maybe cultural norms or cultural memes, that's an interest to extroverted feeling because that's data of what the group dynamic is taking in. That's a social information that's happening across the world basically. And that's very interesting for extroverted feeling or harmony.
Yeah, and I even find myself being interested in that kind of thing to some extent because it's what is the information that's being disseminated around.
Whereas if you contrast this with my polarity, so I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, my judging process, in the auxiliary or co-pilot position, is what we call authenticity. The technical name is introverted feeling. And in my 10-year-old or tertiary process is technically called extroverted thinking, or we've nicknamed it effectiveness. This is my polarity, and it's not so much interested in information, specifically how we think about things. It's more about how we do things in the world, how things get done, or the actions we take. And so authenticity or introverted feeling is interested in what is the right action, what resonates, what's the moral or ethical action to take. It's very interested in that kind of thing. And then on the other side of the coin for extroverted thinking or effectiveness, it's asking what works, what gets the job accomplished, devoid of maybe the ethical stance, just get it done kind of question basically. But these two play together in my personality to get a nuanced understanding around this. But both are interested in making things happen in a sense, what should be happening, how things will happen, the actions around life and things that get done in the world.
Right. And that's why introverted feeling is so, conviction is so important.
Yeah.
Because conviction is what fuels your behavior even when you don't feel motivated. It actually creates a motivation to behave in certain ways.
Yeah.
Extroverted thinking is about making sure that things play out in the outside world in the way that gets the goal accomplished. And we just mentioned both of these polarities. Introverted thinking, it doesn't care what other people have to say. It doesn't care what other people are thinking. It just wants clean data. Extroverted feeling doesn't really care about the subjective makes sense. It just wants the collective truth. But they're polarities. No cognitive function is an island. They always fuel each other. And in particular with polarities, there is no such thing as completely pure data without any sort of, human component in there or any sort of general consensus. Math is maybe the purest data-filled language of all, but we're still checking our work with each other to make sure that our math is good, right? We still need a consensus to say, yeah, you're doing math the right way. And the same thing with introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking gets things done without necessarily taking the ethical consideration into it, but that never plays out in reality. There's always going to be an ethical whispering in the ear of extroverted thinking. There's now what those ethics are is individualized, but there's always going to be a piece of it of, is this the right thing to be doing? And the same thing applies to introverted feeling. It's about conviction, but why is it about conviction? Because I'm trying to get something done in the outside world.
Trying to make a different life, different reality, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So these polarities are really important to understand. It's not just the pure function, it's how the polarities themselves influence the individual. So now that we've established that, now let's talk about how it plays into your belief system. So when you look at your belief system or your worldview, fundamentally you're asking the question about your belief system or worldview. You're asking whether or not it satisfies the criteria of that polarity. And so for all people who use introverted thinking and extroverted feeling, so these would be TPs and FJs in the Myers-Briggs system, they're trying to figure out what makes belief sense. Does this make sense to me? Does it make analytical sense? Does this line up with all the information that I've taken in? Is this congruent? Is the truth internally consistent? And does it get everybody's needs met? Are people happy with this belief structure? Are we creating harmony with this belief structure? If this were to play out on a global level, would everybody be harmonious? But both of those things need to be satisfied. If we are finding ourselves simply creating, or we are part of something that we think makes everybody happy, but it ignores important truths, that won't get everybody's needs met in the long range, because those truths almost always come back to bite us, right? If we ignore a truth, a universal or if there's such a thing, objective or material or scientific truth, in the meantime, we might all be happy, but not in the sustainable future. Like that will come back to us.
The emperor has no clothes. You
That's
don't
right.
call it out as a people group. The emperor's happy. There's homeostasis for everybody in the audience, the crowd watching the parade go by. But eventually, when the emperor realizes that everybody knew this all along, he's probably going to start killing people in the streets. Like, why didn't you tell me? This kind of thing. Like, somebody needs to call truth out, because it's only going to come back to bite you later.
Right, exactly. And the same thing applies to the reverse of that polarity. If you're getting information that is, that you believe is purely data subjective, makes sense, but as it plays out, it makes everybody miserable. First of all, I don't know if that's necessarily ever an empirical truth. But those kinds of truth, like, you need to incorporate the component of caring about people, because, like, what if the truth is that Mount St. Helens is about to blow, right? And I use that because I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so that's always the volcano I go to. But what if Mount St. Helens is about to blow, and you have that empirical piece of information, but you don't say it to anybody because you just didn't care? Like, that information needs to be disseminated. So is your belief system, is it satisfying both criteria? Is it both getting everybody's needs met and acknowledging the human component, acknowledging that people, have needs to be happy, sustainably happy, and is it also acknowledging and recognizing truth and truths that are coming down the pike, truths that are relearning over time? Because at no point are we like at the acme of information. We are always learning more information, which is the purpose of science. So are we acknowledging science? Are we acknowledging new truths that we are determining are actually facts? And are we recognizing that we are getting everybody's needs met in the meantime? And we are also checking in with the social component. Now, if your belief system or your worldview, and you are a TP or an FJ, if your worldview is not satisfying that criteria, then this is probably not a sustainable belief system or worldview for you. And you need to have a level of radical honesty. This is where your introverted thinking comes in. You need it. I don't care if you're an EFJ and leading with extroverted feeling. You have to incorporate a measure of radical honesty, so you don't just go, oh, yeah, my belief system satisfies that. Like, that's your assumption because you don't know anything else. If you look at it from the outside in, you're going to have to ask yourself some pretty hard truths about it. And it might not be satisfying that criteria. And if that's the case, now you have to figure out what to do about that. So it will push you out of your comfort zone. It will take you to a place where you might not have answers. But it's better to be in a space where you don't have answers. It's better to be in a place where you have some uncertainty than you have answers that you recognize inside of yourself might not be the true ones. That's actually the definition of cognitive dissonance, is holding incongruent beliefs or thoughts and ignoring what's doing to you, which is causing stress. So that is the side road or the side door for people who are TPs and FJs, is that polarity.
Now, do you have an example? You have an example from your own life of you getting out of your paradigm as an ENTP. So you have the auxiliary function or the secondary function of what we call accuracy or introverted thinking is the technical term. Is there an example that you have maybe experienced, or maybe I can think of one too, as we talk about someone that is an FJ, someone's EFJ or IFJ that uses the same polarity that has also shifted their perspective in a significant way around their worldview? For the listeners that are of that type, I think that would be helpful if we can maybe idea generate that together.
Yeah, I know somebody who grew up in a pretty strict fundamentalist religion and has not rejected their religious beliefs. They still have the same religious beliefs, but at a certain point they realized that there were voices that were coming online socially that were voices that maybe hadn't been represented before. In certain communities that had been very marginalized or ignored in the past, they were voices that were getting louder in society. And this person's an INFJ, so they use extroverted feeling as their strength. And of course, the polarity would be extroverted feeling, introverted thinking. And they were recognizing that because these voices aren't going away, right? It's not like this voice is going to pop onto the scene and then somehow just be squashed again. Like the voice is not going anywhere. And there's all these people whose needs have been perpetually unmet. So they had to reevaluate their relationship with their religion, their fundamentalist religion, that before had demonized this demographic of people. They had to reevaluate their relationship with it to say, but these people are not getting their needs met.
And they're not going anywhere. I mean, this is not going to just disappear because we want it to disappear as a religion.
Yeah.
It's here to stay.
Yeah, there's no going back. Once Pandora's box is open, it's pretty much a done deal. And so they said, well, why don't we be inclusive? And so they didn't change their beliefs. They still have very similar fundamentalist beliefs in like the doctrine component. But as far as the fundamentalism, they became far more open. It was a lot less gloom and doom. It was a lot less everybody's going to burn, eventually. And it became more like inclusive and inviting. And so now there's, as far as they're concerned, there's a place for this demographic in amongst their doctrinal beliefs. So they didn't actually leave. They just became more inclusive, and that satisfied their extroverted feeling and introverted thinking. So now, regardless of whether or not you're, I don't, as the listener, I have no idea what your belief system is. And I'm not encouraging people to go against their convictions or belief systems as they are now. I want to encourage people to be willing to get some distance from them and ask themselves whether or not they feel good about those, if those are in alignment with their polarity. And in this particular situation, when the person did that, when they looked at it from a distance, they said, as is, it is not satisfying my polarity. Yeah. So I'm going to have to reevaluate my relationship with this paradigm.
And most of us have it, most people that grew up in the West, I don't, celebrating in the Christian realm, I'll just say it that way, have celebrated things like Christmas and had this idea, this belief around Santa Claus as a little kid. And you reevaluate that belief at some point. Whether your parents were really dumping that onto you or not, that was something that like a lot of people have an experience if you're in like the Christian world of doing that. That's an example. Your experience may not be that if you're listening. That's an example of a lot of people that believe something really strongly till about 7 years old. And they're like, wait a minute, how does that work? And they start asking more questions. And they realize, oh, wait, this is all just something I don't want to believe anymore. And they decide not to believe that thing that they at one time really latched onto. So you probably have some experience of something like that, if not that exact example of having something you firmly believe is true, and then you got some more information or some more perspective and it didn't resonate with you. I know that's a silly example, but I think it's really illustrative to what we're talking about. I'm not saying that your belief currently is silly, like Santa Claus would be. And by the way, if you still believe in Santa Claus, that's cool for me too. I just make sure I make that caveat. But I don't want to say that your belief is silly in its current iteration. I just want to say that you have some experience around expanding yourself. And there's other things as a child you probably believed about the world that you reevaluated growing up. I think all we're saying is that's the same process, the same mechanics that you did for Santa Claus are going to apply to this as well. It feels like the stakes are higher because this feels so much more real. And I will say that from experience, once you go through it, you will be surprised just how similar it is to not believing in Santa Claus anymore.
Well, if that's what your result
is. If that's where you come to.
Yeah.
If that's where you end up.
Yeah, and I think that using that as an analogy is pretty apt because it is a maturing process. As we go, we do mature in how we see the world. And we aren't the same people as we age. And so when our belief system is set, we're changing, but the belief system isn't. And so the belief system isn't growing up with us. So seeing it as a maturation process, seeing it as the belief system growing up with us is actually I think a pretty apt analogy.
It's like updating your software on your computer.
Yeah.
It's like I keep getting a new computer. I don't keep the old software from like 1995.
Yeah.
I update it to the more current software that interfaces with the new hardware.
How does this work out for you as an ENFP? I just described the TIFE polarity, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling polarity. How does this play out for you as an FITE?
I think for me as an ENFP, I think it definitely comes down to because FI and TE, introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, are concerned about what works in the outside world or getting things accomplished or doing things. For me, my access point was my 10-year-old tertiary process. We often talk about that, and you might get the message from us that that's a bad place to go all the time, or it's a defensive place. But I think it's useful as long as it's in its right priority. And for me, it was very useful in seeing, like I mentioned earlier, hey, this wasn't working out the way it was supposed to work out. And that was actually how I started down the road of saying, if it's not working out, does it even resonate with me? And I think that for a lot of FITEs, this is the conversations going on for them. And I think if you reverse that, so if you're a TJ in the Myers-Briggs system, you either have as your strength or your co-pilot that extroverted thinking process, meaning that your either inferior or 10-year-old tertiary process is going to be introverted feeling. So how does that show up for a TJ? And I think for you, it's going to come up that, this worldview might be working for you to some degree on the surface level, like it's getting some things done, but then you go to bed at night kind of dying inside a little bit every once in a while. And that might be an access point for you. You're like, something just feels off. I don't feel like I can show up my true self here. I have what on the outside looks like the perfect life. I've got the right spouse or lover. I've got the right job. I've got all these things in place, but I still feel disconnected. There's a piece missing. And then you start to reevaluate, why am I having this come up? And then you access it and go, well, maybe it isn't working as well as I thought it was. Maybe it isn't actually working out the way I think it is because there's a resonant part that's not there. And I think that's where that can play in for you as a TJ. Now, I'm not a TJ, so I don't know that exact experience for you, but that would be my suspicion based on my experience of talking to so many, ETJs and ITJs around these topics.
I think, too, I have an example of an ENTJ in my mind that reevaluated their paradigm and came to a different conclusion. And what I noticed for them is that it wasn't even just the ethical considerations, although that was a part of it. It was also they felt repressed. They didn't feel like they could show up being honest about themselves. And just like when when somebody who is on the TIFE polarity, the TPs and the FJs of the Myers-Briggs system, when they feel like they can't be intellectually honest, that's something that makes it so they can't sleep at night. It doesn't matter where those polarities fall in your function stack. And I think for the TJs and FPs, which would be who uses extroverted thinking and introverted feeling as their polarity, it doesn't matter where FI is on their stack. If they cannot show up as an individual, if they can't show up being honest, that is something that will be a burr under their saddle.
I'm thinking of an ENTJ in my mind right now who actually is still stuck in their paradigm. They have bought hook, line, and sinker the paradigm they were given as a child. They went through and went ahead into a marriage situation actually specifically, that was supposed to work in the outside world. And it did for a while. Everything worked fine. But now it's not working. They've gotten divorced. There was some infidelity. There was some trouble and struggle there. And it's not working at all. But instead of this person using that as a gauge to go, okay, it's not working, how can I look at my worldview maybe differently? They actually went what I would consider the negative route, and they now are beating themselves up about it. They went straight to that authenticity or introverted feeling process as their inferior and said, it's not working because I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. And they started to just basically self-beat on themselves and say it's all their fault. And they still, after many years of this struggle, are still stuck in this situation. And no matter how much conversation I've had with this person, they just refuse to let go of the belief that they've had that got them in the situation, even if it's not working for them. As a TE or extroverted thinking primary, this is not working. It hasn't worked. It hasn't been working for now going on many years, and they still won't let it go. And they still are beating themselves up about it to the point where I think it's starting to be dangerous for their health. And so this is I don't have a good example like you did of an ETJ, but I had to have a bad example of how that could look, where you're not reevaluating when something comes up for you, a pain point comes up and you're like, oh, it's not working. I think that's a bad road to go down.
I think when it all hits the fan, and this is an area that's tough for people because their belief systems and their worldviews are sacrosanct. Like, it is the one thing you're not allowed to touch. It's the one thing you're not allowed to question. It's the one thing that's going to get the most kickback. And so because we don't have permission to go there, if you suggest it, you are definitely the bad guy. Like, you are wrong for suggesting somebody reevaluate their belief system. Even if you say, hey, it's okay to loop back. It's okay if after all of this, if it's truly authentic for you, then that's okay. That's fine. If you just suggest it, it becomes something where, you're, I don't know, it's even more so than, I think the corollary in my mind is like parenting and relationships. Like we all assume that we're going to be the best parents. We all assume that we're going to know how to navigate through relationships. And if you give anybody any sort of like parenting advice or question their parenting, people will like flip out on you. Not everybody, but most people are like, oh, well, you're saying I'm a bad parent? Because there's a lot of ego in there. There's a lot of like, oh, I don't want to think that I'm damaging my child, which I most assuredly am. It doesn't matter how amazing a parent you are causing trauma to your child. And that's just something you don't want to have to look at. Like, you're just like, please don't point out to me how much trauma I'm causing my child. Please don't reflect back to me my terrible, terrible parenting. And it's an insecurity, and that's why.
I'm going to buy you a mom's greatest t-shirt for your birthday.
Okay. Make sure it's like really glittery.
Number one mom.
Make sure it's super bedazzled, all right? Because that's like, that's like the number one thing I would wear. Thank you. So there's like... This is like the worst thing I can think of.
Bedazzled, sparkly.
Oh, this is awful. Okay.
Rhinestones.
Yeah. All right. Like that aside, it's the same thing with your belief system. If you say, hey, so maybe you should think about the thing that got you here, which is your entire experience and how you view everything, you're basically telling the person like to potentially undermine everything. And that person is going to say, what? You think that I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible evaluator of beliefs. And there's a lot of ego wrapped up because our belief systems are also part of our identity. Just like our children are part of our identity, our belief systems are part of our identity. It's all wrapped up in our ego. It's all wrapped up in this thing that, like, don't insinuate that I could be making the worst decisions of my life ever with this belief system. Please don't insinuate that, because I don't want to have to look at that. That's a possibility that I just do not want to be looking at. So this is a tough one. This is a very difficult one. Just insinuating it will get you a kickback.
And how silly and foolish you feel when you go through the process of going, I believe this way one time, or I have this worldview, I've expanded it, or I've changed it, or I've altered it in this way. The first step is things come up for you. They're not working. They're not resonating. They're not getting harmony, or they're not making sense. I think the first step is somebody tries to reconcile everything. They're like, well, I'll work really hard to reconcile things, but then you can't reconcile, and then you eventually move on from the worldview. There's this thing that comes up, man, I feel so stupid. Like, how could I have gone so long without having this new perspective? So by rejecting a new perspective or rejecting seeing something outside that worldview, you're staying in congruity and saying, I'm not a stupid, silly person. I want you to see me as smart and savvy. I would have believed this all along had it been the right way. So I can't adopt it now. Otherwise, I will look like, for the first so many years of my life, I was an idiot or something. And I would say just let go of that, because we all are growing and changing. I mean, that you have to embrace the foolishness of growth, really, in a sense. You've got to be okay with looking silly at one time because you got to grow here. And I think that's something that it is a tough challenge. I mean, it feels like your heart's being ripped out, or you're like losing your ego or identity, like you're just taking this massive hit.
Well, I think this is another place where typology is going to influence this piece as well. You're actually talking about that I just mentioned it too, that your ego is wrapped up and your identity is wrapped up, but I bet that that's probably a very specifically introverted feeling or FP reason to hold on to a belief system, is because you don't want to look foolish or like your ego is so wrapped up in it.
It feels closer to your identity than it does probably from other types.
Right. And I would say that an introverted thinker, or somebody who uses introverted thinking rather than TPs, one of the reasons why they might cling on to it is because they don't want to seem like they've been stupid the whole time. They've been fooled by a belief system, that they just didn't have the analytical skills to be able to, look at it cleanly. And I bet for people who use extroverted feeling, it's about their social system. It's about all the people they'll hurt if they end up graduating from wherever they were, especially if they're leaving people behind. Now, if you don't have ego, in your introverted feeling identity piece, that's not going to apply to you. If you don't feel like like you're supposed to have all the answers, it's not going to hit you in introverted thinking. And if you don't have a social system set up that is like a part of your belief system, this is not going to hold you back. But if you do, these are the things that are going to probably trip you up in even potentially evaluating your system. And then for extroverted thinking, the fourth and final is, what are the systems of your life that you've set up that you're going to have to now like dismantle and rebuild? Like, think about the energy that goes into that.
It's a lot of work.
So much work. So, and what if you don't have an entire system around you that has been wrapped up into this belief system, it's probably going to be less work. So you're going to be more likely to reevaluate. So then another piece where personality type comes into it is your reluctance to reevaluate your belief system is also going to be tied in with how much you've got invested in it based on your judging process. So the more you have invested with your judging process, the less likely you are to reevaluate. And
the bigger ego hit will happen when you do.
Right. Or work, or hurt feelings, or feelings of foolishness.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's going to be more at stake. And I would argue that the more you have at stake, the more likely it is that you've been ignoring some signals. The more you are invested in it, the more likely it is that there are red flags that you've not been paying attention to, because you can't look at those things because of the stakes. So,
or you could see the other alternative. I mean, you and I were extremely invested in our paradigms and worldviews. I mean, to the point where we dedicated our lives to it, and we played them out. Well, this is how I see it as a FITE. I played it out in the outside world to its ultimate conclusions, and it didn't work for me, and that's what triggered me over into that.
That is also true.
So I think one of the things that got me out of that was because I bought in and had so much invested, not because I didn't in that specific example for my life. Now, mileage varies, but I don't know if that's your experience as well. But I think that I got to the end of the road and went, okay, where do I go from here? There was nowhere else to go but to reevaluate the worldview itself, because I had explored all of the immersion of the worldview itself at that level.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the more your behavior matches your worldview, the more invested you are through actually behavior, you're probably going to get to the end of it, and you're going to be at a better space to reevaluate. Or alternatively, the more you will be encouraged to continue that path because you are being rewarded. I mean, I would say that I'm in a belief system now, a paradigm now, that I find incredibly rewarding. And the more I'm in that belief system, the belief system of helping humanity, getting into personal development, the more I go down this, I mean, this is the infrastructure of my mind. This is a belief system or a worldview. This is a paradigm for me. And the more I'm invested in this and the more I pour myself into it, the more I'm rewarded, and I think I'm on the right path. So the more you invest like your time, effort, energy, etc. into this worldview, the more it's either going to play out to its eventual conclusion, or the more you're going to be reaffirmed that this is the right way to go. It's sort of that wishy-washy in between where you've got all your ego wrapped up in it, or you've got all your either your emotional identity ego or your analytical intellectual ego, or you've got all of your social system, or you've got your entire goal-oriented system invested in this without you actually being invested as an individual. That's usually probably about the worst space you can be in. So this concept of personality type and how we attach and detach and how we move through our belief systems and our paradigms, I think this is something that has a lot of nuance to it. And, again, your conclusion is going to vary depending upon where you're at. Like whether or not you get to the end of this and go, oh my God, I just completely don't believe anything I ever thought before. Or whether you get to the end of it and go, nope, I am on the right path. I am absolutely where I need to be. That is completely individualized to you. But the question is, do you give yourself permission to even have this conversation? And that's more what we're encouraging people to do, is give yourself permission and use an understanding of typology, functions, and how your polarities work within you. Use this as your side door to enter the conversation if you never have before.
What do you think? You've been listening here. You've been part of this conversation. You haven't been able to talk back yet. But if you go over to personalityhacker.com, I want to hear from you. Right below this podcast, leave a comment, ask a question, share your experience with us and the other people that are part of this community. We want to hear from you. This is a conversation, not just a podcast. And I think your voice needs to be expressed. What has been your experience with Worldview? Or do you believe you're zoomed way in? Do you believe your ego's attached to it? Do you believe it's something that you can reevaluate? Do you believe that it's been working, not working? Where are you in this process? Like, have you gone through a questioning period and you came and you looped back and said, no, I really reaffirm how I see the world? Or have you never done that in your life? Maybe you're younger and you haven't done that yet. And that's something you're really looking forward to do in the next few years. Or maybe you're older and now you're finally into your life or near the end of your life or something. And you're saying, maybe I want to reevaluate this now. Life's not over yet. I've got all the time in the world still because I'm still alive. I'm in the present moment. I want to reevaluate this. We want to hear from you. Again, personalityhacker.com. is the best place to go and leave a comment or ask a question. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personality hacker. And we're also on twitter.com/personality hack, HACK.
If you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us out quite a bit.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.